Aloha, everyone. Good evening and welcome to our second session of I MUA HAWAIʻI. For those who joined us at our first session, welcome back. And to those who are new, welcome and thanks for joining us tonight. Our topic of the night is sustainability, and I am so honored to introduce our expert panelists tonight. First, beginning with Dr. Chip Fletcher. He is the Interim Dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He is Chairperson of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission, a prominent public speaker, and contributor to local and national media. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you.
Next, we have Senator Chris Lee. He currently represents the 25th Senatorial District and is a member of the Senate Transportation, Energy, Economic Development, and Tourism and Judiciary committees. He previously chaired the Committee on Energy Environmental Protection as a member of the House of Representatives from 2012 to 2018. Mahalo, Senator Lee. And last, we have Ikaika Anderson, father, caregiver, and public servant who has dedicated over 2 decades of his professional career working for the people of Hawaii. He is a former city council chair and presently a candidate for lieutenant governor. Thank you, Ikaika. I want to say hello to all the attendees who are joining us tonight. Please utilize the Q&A function to ask us questions. The panelists are here to answer them tonight. And I want to remind you that this is an interactive dialogue series and we appreciate your involvement as it helps to shape the conversation that is taking place. I would like to begin with our first question. Where do we stand as a global community today? And could I have Dr. Chip Fletcher lead us?
Thanks, Kathy. And aloha, everybody. Wonderful of you to spend your precious evening here learning something about climate change. I do appreciate your time. So in 2015, the United Nations convened one of their annual meetings on the subject of climate change. And for the first time, all of the world's nations agreed to cut their greenhouse gas emissions in order to stop global warming at 2 degrees Celsius. We currently have warmed since the late 1800s, anywhere from 1.1 to 1.3 degrees Celsius. Now, 2 degrees Celsius is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And when you walk under the shade, as you're walking down the sidewalk and come back out into the sun, you're experiencing much more than just 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit change in temperature. But let's imagine that your 98.6 degree body temperature goes up 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. You're suddenly running a medium grade fever of 102 degrees. You don't feel well, you don't go to work that day, and you're starting to think about seeing the doctor or going to the hospital. This is the appropriate way to think of these small temperature changes because they represent a fundamental change in the energetics of the system. And when you fundamentally change the temperature of Earth's surface, all things respond, all living things, all ecologies, and all natural environments. In 2018, a report came out investigating what are the impacts of warming to 1.5 degrees, less than that 2 degrees. And the conclusion was that human global security, economic security, our social political systems would be at risk because large parts of the planet would begin to experience extreme weather events, pervasive drought, sea level rise displacing millions of people, huge storms, and basically food and water insecurity would begin to grow on continental areas, largely in the tropics around the world, displacing human communities. They would be needing to find new places to live. And that's just at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is a body temperature of 101 degrees Fahrenheit, if you will. So that became the new international target, to stop warming at 1.5. Now, the pathway to stopping warming at 1.5 degrees means that we must cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of this decade. That's 8 years from now, cutting our global greenhouse gas emissions by about 50%. And we recently had the latest United Nations meeting in Glasgow, Scotland. It ended in November, and a new round of promises from the world's nations were posed. And if you take all those promises and you plot out what the new pledges in reducing greenhouse gas emissions means in terms of global temperature by the end of the century, it turns out that we only stand a 34% probability of stopping warming at 2 degrees and a 1.5% probability of stopping warming at 1.5 degrees, which is considered by scientists to be the safe threshold for humanity on the planet. The Washington Post came out with a study during the Glasgow conference announcing that on average, nations underreported their greenhouse gas emissions by 23%. And it's also realized that what nations promise is very different from what they actually fund and exercise in terms of burning fossil fuels. So we have underreporting, we have a difference between what's promised and what is actually burnt in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And it turns out that today, photosynthesis on land pulls about 30% of the carbon dioxide that we emit out of the air and stores it in plants and in the soil. But that partner in managing climate is becoming unstable. In fact, the Amazon rainforest, which holds more than half of all the rainforest on the planet, is now a net greenhouse gas emitter because 1/3 of the biomass in the Amazon has been destroyed over the last decade by deforestation, wildfire, hunting, mining, damming rivers, and spreading drought and heat that's killing trees. Now, climate change has been best described as an instability multiplier. And we are currently on a pathway, when you take all these factors into effect, we're currently on a pathway of over 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century. And that amount of warming has been projected to displace 1/3 of humanity, meaning that areas that are too hot for humans to live, equivalent to the center of the Sahara Desert, expand to become 1/5 of all continental lands, displacing over 3 billion people needing to migrate to find new homelands. And as they attempt to move into neighboring countries and across borders, we're going to find a mix of generosity and, far more likely, closing of borders so that borders stand a strong chance of becoming conflict zones. So this is extremely dark news. And I'm going to wait until the next round of questions before I focus on Hawaii, because I think there's very good news for Hawaii in all of this. So thank you very much. That's a background for where we sit with climate change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, for sharing your insights with us. Could I have Senator Lee answer this question as well? Where do we stand as a global community today?
Sure. I recognize there's already questions about some of the stuff we want to talk about piling up, which we'll get to in just a sec. But as I think frustrating as everything Chip's talking about is, there is some hope. And I think I was in Glasgow, this past November at the climate conference that Chip was talking about, along with a great number of other leaders from national governments around the world. And it was funny because like half the time, we're in this very secure, sealed environment where you have everybody in suits where they're representing the United States and everything. And watching our elected leaders, President Biden and others, try and negotiate with other heads of state. Very frustrating, a lot of global politics. And the bottom line is there's not a lot of movement. But then you walk right outside the security gates and there's like 100,000 people gathered and they're outside protesting barbecuing, just hanging out, hoping, pleading for something to be done about this issue. And there's students, young kids in the street who are out there, Greta and some of the other, the international climate leaders of their generation. And it was so fantastic to just take off my jacket, walk outside, pick up a protest sign and join them at times. But what was so exciting about it was that in spite of like all this attention on those two things, a lot of people gathering and hoping for something and not seeing the kind of international leaders step up to the plate and doing the sweeping change that we want to see at the state and subnational level. Hawaii, for example, and others like us, other states, other provinces, other cantons around the world are the ones actually stepping up to the plate. And we've seen agreements at the subnational level to curtail emissions, to adapt to our changing climate, to do all the things that people are hoping for that isn't being done on the global scale. And what that influence is having is an impact on those global negotiations, because now countries have a goalpost. Hawaii, for example, being the first state to commit to 100% clean energy, has radically transformed the political landscape in national politics on this. So it's really exciting seeing opportunity present itself. We're not there yet. We're not even remotely close, but that door has cracked open. And we have an opportunity as a state to really step into that and push to actually change things that people want to see and make sure that here in Hawaii, we have all the benefits. We can limit the impacts that we're going to feel and hopefully lead the way, demonstrating for other states in our country and around the world that change is possible. So I'm kind of on the optimist side of things. And I think there is opportunity before us.
Thank you, Senator. May I have Ikaika answer our question for us? Where do we stand as a global community today?
Thank you very much, Kathy, for the question. Would also like to join Dr. Fletcher and Senator Lee in thanking the audience for spending your valuable evening with us this evening to talk story and share ideas on climate change. As the chair of the Honolulu City Council, I did lead the effort to fund the Office of Climate Change and Resiliency that was passed as a charter amendment question in the 2018 general election. We are so fortunate in that office to have a great leader who was very capable and willing to work with both the legislative branch and the administrative branch in government, Josh Stanborough. Really stepped forward to offer some solid policy initiatives. We've had some great discussions with him. Honolulu also stood steadfast in our effort, in our attempt to hold the fossil fuel industry responsible for their contributions to climate change. And we had actually had the opportunity to ask some of our fellow counties to join us in holding the fossil fuel industry accountable. And some of our fellow counties did do that. Additionally, I see one of the questions here about food sustainability and preventing wealthy potential landowners from buying agriculture property and creating gentleman farms. In Honolulu, some years back, the city and county of Honolulu required, in order for an agricultural property to not be assessed with increasingly high property taxes and higher assessed values, if folks were actually going to farm agricultural zone land and were going to receive substantial tax breaks for their efforts, it was necessary to both dedicate your property to agriculture for a set amount of time and to also file a agricultural plan with the city and county of Honolulu that had to be accepted in order for said property to be placed into that agricultural category. And believe it or not, the city actually did checking into these properties to ensure that the ag plans were being followed. Certainly more can be done. We're also discussing in regards to food sustainability, restricting the size of agricultural dwellings, and also placing severe restrictions on accessory uses on ag properties, all of which I think are solid and sound policies. I will be the first to tell you, as a policymaker, I am not an expert in climate change. Realized that early on. But what I did do is reach out to people like Josh Stanbro for their knowledge and for their expertise in that field in working to create policy. We've started a discussion at the City and County of Honolulu on climate change and climate retreat, particularly in our residential communities, which granted was not going to make some of our coastal property owners very pleased. But it was a discussion that Josh and I both felt that we need to have. And I'm hopeful that we can start to have a broader discussion on all of those items at a state level. That would involve the state administration, our state legislators, as well as our county elected officials, bringing in together people like Josh Stanbro, people like Dr. Fletcher, and having solid discussions with our community to move policy forward on these efforts.
Thank you, Ikaika. I want to dive into our next question for the night, and this is directed towards Dr. Chip Fletcher. What are the implications for Hawaii for the current pathway for global warming? And could you talk more about the sea level rise?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So Hawaii is very lucky in that we are surrounded by the ocean. The oceans are warming slower than the continents. The oceans are capable of storing huge amounts of heat, whereas the continents are warming, as a global pathway where we've reached so far about 1.1 to 1.3 degrees warming thus far. Continents on average have warmed 4 degrees Celsius already. And this is why every summer we see in the Northern Hemisphere extreme heat waves, wildfire, spreading drought. Every state, including the Rockies and to the west, has been in a drought approaching 10 years now. And the 4 major reservoirs in the western states are below 30% of their capacity. The governor of California has declared a water crisis. And these are all signals that the impacts of climate change are having an effect already. But Hawaii has not yet hit a temperature over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet, perhaps you remember from early June up in the Pacific Northwest and in Western Canada, British Columbia, Vancouver area, they hit temperatures of 113, 115 degrees. They don't have air conditioning up there because they've never needed it historically. It's very rare to find air conditioning. And there were over 1,000 people that died of heat-related illness during that 1-week event. Hospitals became overflowing. So Hawaii is also going to see declining rainfall and an increase in extreme rainfall. So rain becomes more flashy. Now, this is not good for recharging our aquifers. The best type of rainfall for recharging our aquifers is a long, slow rain that lasts over several days, hopefully over a week or so, and then it soaks in and recharges our freshwater aquifers where we get our fresh water. But an intense rainstorm mostly runs off into the ocean and does not do much in terms of supplying our water resources. There are other impacts that Hawaii will experience, but as I mentioned earlier, the #1 impact that climate change exerts on a community is that it finds the instabilities of a community and it multiplies those. So if you think about where our Hawaiian community has fractures, those will be wedged open. And we have a huge homeless and houseless population growing. We have 150 years or more of the Western knee on the neck of the Native Hawaiian culture. We have a stolen kingdom. We have a continental system of land use policies not scaled to island needs or island knowledge. All of these are reasons why as the stress of climate change works at our socioeconomic system here in Hawaii, it may wedge us apart. But we have a cultural background of aloha, and it's absolutely critical. More than stopping our greenhouse gas emissions, more than growing our own food, it is critical that we solve the problem of a divided, potentially disagreeing population here in Hawaii. And so things like affordable housing, jobs, the ALICE population, where you have families that are employed, making an income, but they can't make ends meet. They have to choose between putting food on the table and paying rent or paying a mortgage. Social support, childcare, medical support, education, pulling folks out of poverty. These are the critical things that we need to do, because we already have the benefit of a culture of loving the land and loving each other. We need to take those seriously, because those will get us through the difficult times that climate change has in our future. It's also a blessing that we are an isolated group of islands. We will not have these border conflict zones that so many other nations will have. Yet at the same time, we have to wean ourselves off of the daily influx of all our goods and services that come from aviation and from the shipping sector. We have to better manage our water. We have a system of reservoirs around the state that need to be renovated and strategically re-engineered to recharge our aquifer systems and to store water, rather than let that precious fresh water that we get from the sky run off into the ocean. We need to do a better job of growing our own food. And I personally look at our decarbonization efforts of moving away from fossil fuel and towards renewable energy as actually an effort towards becoming more sustainable as an isolated community later on in the century. By mid-century, we'll be able to supply our own energy and be a modern, thriving digital society because we'll be able to supply our electricity without having to rely on tankers that come in from Russia and Libya as we currently do. So I think we have an enormous amount of reason to be hopeful here. We know what work lays ahead of us and we're making progress on it. And I would rather be in Hawaii than any place else in the world with my family. I think we have the brightest future. So I'll pass on the mic from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. I wanted to go in depth regarding the Hawaii sea level rise with you, and I understand that you can show us the viewer by sharing your screen.
Sure. Let me share my screen. And there is an online location where our research team at University of Hawaii has placed data showing the potential impacts of sea level rise. So you want to Google HI space SLR, which is sea level rise viewer. And this takes us to a site that we have at the university called the Pacific Island Ocean Observing System, or PAC-IUS. And if you want to know, if you want a projection for surf, for currents, or anything having to do with ocean weather, if you will, this site will provide it to you. So you go to shoreline impacts and over here to sea level rise viewer, click there. This is the sea level rise viewer. So right here, we get to view it in full screen. And here's a pull down menu. Let's go to Oahu. And let's look at a base map of a satellite image. And we can zoom in. or we can go to a site from the pull-down menu. Let's go to Waikiki. And we can even zoom in further. And over here, we can look at 3.2 feet of sea level rise, which is about a meter of sea level rise, which our models are projecting to occur before the end of the century. By the end of the century, if the Antarctic ice sheet doesn't misbehave itself and continues melting as projected by our physical models, we're probably looking at about 4 feet of sea level rise in the tropical Pacific by the end of the century. So 3.2 feet of sea level rise is someplace after mid-century, but before the end of the century. And this red line shows lands that are likely to be lost because of coastal erosion. The landward edge of the red line is the 80% probability of land loss due to sea level rise. We can also look at seasonal wave flooding. So, here on the South Shore, we get our largest waves in the summertime. And at high tide, this is how they will be running across Ala Moana Park onto the boulevard, waves propagating up into the alawai and overflowing the edges, and then waves overflowing across the shoreline. And then there's the simple issue of, with sea level rise, parts of the land will become below sea level. So that's a simple elevation issue, and that's shown here. Now, some of these areas, like up here in Macaulay, are not connected to the ocean. So the flooding up here will come from the water table rising, which we know is connected to the ocean. In fact, the water table under this whole area and under most urbanized coastal areas goes up and down with the tides. So we know it's directly connected to the ocean. Now let's combine all these, and we have what's known as the sea level rise exposure area. And so all of these hazards, erosion, wave run-up, high tide flooding. This is the portion of the community where we need to figure out, are we going to adapt our community design to live with water, or are we going to retreat from this area and move to an area that is not exposed to flooding because of sea level rise? And these are huge questions that have no immediate answers. So I'll stop with that. And if there are any questions specific to these maps, I'll be happy to ask them now. If someone would take a look at the Q&A and let me know.
So Dr. Fletcher, these are the maps for Waikiki at roughly 1 meter.
Correct.
So from your point of view, from the research that you've done and what you've gathered on this subject, what policies could be considered to help mitigate this even a little bit at this point?
Well, we're not going to stop sea level rise. In fact, models project sea level continuing to rise even if we stop global warming at 2 degrees Celsius. Sea levels will continue to rise for 1,000 years because the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet and the thermal expansion of the ocean all need to get into an equilibrium with the 2 degrees Celsius temperature of the air. That will take over 1,000 years. So sea level rise is permanent, and it's up to us to adjust to it. In looking at Waikiki, we have to think about the many jobs that it provides. We have to think about the transportation of people who come from far away every day to work in Waikiki. We need to worry about access on roads that are going to be flooded, as well as whether or not the commercial areas in Waikiki are going to be able to adjust to the fact that they are going to be surrounded by water? How do we learn to live with water through redesigning open space, buried infrastructure like sewage pipes and freshwater delivery systems, our building stock, and our transportation systems, our roads? And those questions are being discussed. I think, in fact, there's a bill at the legislature, maybe more than one, that is proposing funding a large consulting project to sort of reimagine Waikiki and Kaka'ako under roughly 1 meter of sea level rise. But then we go to other areas like Sunset Beach, and here is the Sunset Beach Park. And you can see that wave run up and coastal erosion are projected to take out dozens and dozens of homes. And if you're familiar with what it looks like up there just this week, you know that there are a dozen homes that are being undermined by the swell that hit recently. So is this a community that can stay in place and adapt to sea level rise? The only way to do that is to build huge seawalls in front of these communities, and that will kill the beach, because as the ocean rises, beaches need to migrate landward or they will drown in place. And underneath this whole community is sand that erosion would release and feed to the beach, even as the beach migrates landward with rising sea level. So to me, I think the question is, what's the exit strategy for these homes? What is the redesign strategy for the one road that runs along the windward side and North Shore? And so I think for different types of communities, you've got a different set of questions, which are based on sociology of the community, the economics of the community, the degree of development, and other issues.
We have a question from Wayne Hirano, who asked, how will sea level rise affect Kahe power plant?
So let's see, Waianae, yeah? Well, let's hit Eva as closest location. All right, so there's Eva Beach and Kahe Point Power Plant. Well, we have a significant problem with access just to the west side. The road is threatened with undermining, and we have wave run up. The power plant itself looks like it's up above any direct inundation, but you do have infrastructure down here on the shoreline, which is part of their water intake and outflow. And while we're at it, what does Ko'olina look like? Ko'olina, in fact, is perched up on a limestone plateau. And if you were to point to one place which might become sort of the future gateway for tourism, Ko'olina is not as threatened by sea level rise as Waikiki is.
Thank you for sharing this map with us, Dr. Fletcher. And if you can, send the link in the chat so that our attendees can access this map after our session concludes.
Will do.
You know, while we're on the topic of sea level rise, I have a question for Senator Lee as well as Ikaika. You know, what is government doing? Do you think government is out of touch with the realities of sea level rise, climate change, and the environmental impacts that are taking place? And does more need to be done?
Sure, Ikaika, you want me to go first? Jump in. You want to jump in? I'll. You know, it's a complicated question, because it's true that I think government is out of touch in a lot of ways, but at the same time, here in Hawaii, it is the public feeling the effects of shoreline erosion and loss of rainfall, just hotter days. I mean, all the things that make climate tangible and actually impact people, that is starting to push government to really take not just baby steps, but take bigger steps. But there's a lot we got to do. So I think we have sort of set ourselves up in a great spot. The city and county, the work that it's done over the last 5-6 years, establishing the Office of Climate Change and Resiliency, taking steps to start implementing meaningful change, trying to get people into cheaper electric cars, and all the things that it's been doing to prepare has been amazing, because the state's really been behind compared to the city in some respects. In the broader picture, we are in a good trajectory. I think we talk about moving toward 100% clean energy in the next 25 years or so by 2045. We're on track, which is great. The state had, I think, heard from a lot of people out there. We have a goal to absorb more carbon emissions than we give off within the next 25 years as an entire economy here in the state. But it's going to take a lot more steps to actually implement a lot of those pieces. And that's where I think there is a lot more to be done. So we're not moving as fast as we probably need to be in a lot of ways. And that's where I think we're kind of out of touch, because every dollar we put into addressing some of these things today is going to save us and our kids countless dollars down the road from an economic perspective. And of course, when it comes to just preserving the beaches that we enjoyed growing up and preserving that way of life, that's something that I think people don't really think about. We're still worried about the potholes in front of us in our roads right now, on our highways, and as our kid going to school, and all the basic day-to-day stuff that people are struggling with. So it's going to take more, but I feel like there is progress, and what we really need are next steps to really start to implement some of the bigger changes to come.
I would agree with Senator Lee that government is not doing enough. I believe government's making progress, but I would agree with the senator that more certainly can be done, pointing back to the effort of the city and county of Honolulu to create the Office of Climate Change and Resiliency, and actually having a climate resiliency officer to put forth responsible policy, and then take that policy and turn it over to policymakers at the Honolulu City Council, where I served, to the mayor of the city and county of Honolulu, and having an executive in the mayor's office that believed in what the office was actually promoting, I felt really helped. We had discussions that would require ordinance changes to put forth, for example, as Senator Lee mentioned, with electric vehicles, ordinance that would require additional electric vehicle charging stations, for example, when larger commercial areas were going to be built, having this infrastructure actually put in place, government requiring it, so that once these new facilities came online, you would have these larger shopping malls, these larger areas that attract people, being able to provide for these electric vehicle charging stations that are going to be necessary and also going to be normal into everyday life if government continues to require these changes. As human beings, though, I found just over the course of my lifetime, we are creatures that do not adapt willingly to change. We don't like change, and we do everything that we possibly can to resist it. I get that, I appreciate it. But I have to say that upon the city and county of Honolulu making the decision to put that question on the ballot, to amend the city charter, to create that office of climate change and resiliency, really was a step in the right direction. And some folks did come forward and actually ask the city council at that time not to fund the office. Yes, it passed, but there's no requirement, there's no mandate to the mayor and to the legislative branch to fund that office. And that's true, there was no mandate. But not funding the office, to me, would have been detrimental, first of all. Secondly, when people say, well, the office really had no teeth, no force in policy. Yes, that's true. But you had a mayor, you had a council that really believed in putting forth these policies. not only discussing them, but coming up with sound policy, and then an administration that would take these policies, turn them over to a department like the Department of Planning and Permitting, and telling the director and telling the support staff, you will now go ahead and implement these policies. That's important. And just merely having the force of law, if you don't have people who are experts in their respective fields crafting that law, you're really setting yourselves, as well as government, the people it serves, up for disaster. And the best way to really create these policies is to bring experts forward, sometimes in a non-binding way, like with the Office of Climate Change and Resiliency that the city started, really having the discussions there, and then the elected policymakers passing them on to the department people and telling them, here's the changes that we're going to implement and you need to do it. And I think that can work well, but we need to have the right people having these discussions.
Ikaika, could a new state administration implement a similar office?
I believe a new state administration could implement a similar office within the administration and set that up so you have a state administration that would work with the House, work with the Senate, and with the various departments in crafting solid policy. But you'd have to have an administrative branch that was willing to work with the legislative branch, much like we had at Honolulu Hale. I must say the Caldwell administration was very friendly in looking at these policies, welcoming all points of view. Even developers were asked for their mana'o on these policies. In addition to folks like Josh Stanbro. And oftentimes you had people sitting in a room telling each other, we don't agree with you. We're not sure we want to move these policies forward. What I saw happen in that regard is you had both sides saying, okay, let's take a look at what we don't agree on. Let's set those topics here on the side and let's focus on what we do agree on. And that's when we had policy like the electrical charging stations for electric vehicles come forward. Small policy changes, of course, but that's really where it starts. Let's look at what we can agree on and move forward with that first and foremost, because I believe there is a lot that we could agree on.
We have a question from Kevin, one of the attendees, and this is for all of our panelists. How do the masses afford this? I love to eat at Whole Foods every day, have a Prius and panels on my roof, but not feasible. Can someone address this for us?
Sure, I'll jump in. You know, I think Ikaika is right. And Kevin, I think your point is spot on, because, you know, when we saw, for example, the rollout of solar panels for everybody, it was typically wealthier folks that took advantage first. And the folks who didn't were obviously those who couldn't afford it. But that's where we can work together. And I think that's what Ikaika is alluding to, that you have state government, you have the counties, you have all these other players who have the resources and the ability to put policies in place that help correct that, so that the benefits of doing this are spread to everybody. And what's interesting is when you think about how you can eat healthier and better and all that, that has a lower footprint on the environment. When you want to drive an EV, for example, when you want to put solar panels on your roof, all these things, we're at a point where technology is evolving so rapidly that it's going to save money for everybody, not just today, but certainly in the long run as well. EVs are already as cheap to purchase as the typical equivalent gas car. In your average, brand new Honda Accord is the same as like a Tesla Model 3. It's kind of crazy. And you have cheaper gas, obviously, because you don't pay for gas. You're paying for significantly cheaper electricity. You don't have to pay for maintenance. Same with solar on your roof, right? You make the investment and it saves you a ton of money. The payback's like 5 to 7 years, depending on what you're doing. But in order to make that possible to access, so that you can save money from day one, that's where programs from the state and the counties can come in to help foot that upfront cost for people who can't afford it, and then let them reap the benefits the whole time. Immediately lower electric bills, immediately lower transportation costs, and on and on. And that's something that we really need to work on, because to this point, the benefits have been a little bit lopsided, but working together, I think, with the right policies in place. I think Ikaika's suggestion, talking about creating a state level similar office to what they have at the city, that can look at policy and develop it and figure out how to implement it. I mean, that would be huge, in addition to consolidating some of that work, which is kind of just all over the place at the state level right now.
So I have a answer for Kevin. My own personal experience. We put solar panels on my house back in I think it was 2018. Now there are 9 people that live in my house. I have my 3 kids. I have 2 sons-in-law, and I have a couple of grandkids kicking around. So we have a huge electrical bill, and we didn't have to make a down payment because there were state and federal subsidies that covered that. And the remainder was paid by a loan from the Hawaii State Credit Union that had no interest due for 2 years. And we worked it out that instead of paying HECO for our energy costs every month, we paid Hawaii State Credit Union to pay them back for the loan for the panels on the roof. And within 2 years, we no longer owed the credit union any money. We had paid the installer with the state and federal subsidies that were available. And our monthly electricity bill is less than 10% of what it was before that. So I hardly had any money out of pocket at all. This is not, it is set up, at least it was 3 years ago, so that it's not just the area of the wealthy to participate in.
It also does help to look, as Senator Lee mentioned, at the side-by-side cost comparisons. For example, with the electric vehicle versus the fuel costs of a gasoline vehicle, especially with fuel costs now hovering at north of $4.50 a gallon for regular. If you're on a neighbor island, those costs are now north of $5 per gallon. So when I had a small 6-cylinder SUV back in 2020, I was paying nearly $350 per month in fuel costs. I'd certainly be paying a lot more in fuel costs just for that vehicle now if I still had it. Yes, I drive an electric vehicle now. The sticker price of the electric vehicle was nearly identical to the SUV that I had, but my fuel charges, especially with my solar panels, has come way down. Also need to mention, there are so many places on Oahu now that have free charging available, provided you get to an area where you can find an open stall. Ala Moana has a number. Kailua has a few stalls as well that are free of charge. And of course, there are always those stalls available where you pay for the electricity usage, but still the cost on that, from what I've seen in my own budgeting, has been significantly less with the electric vehicle than it was with the gasoline. So it's also making those side-by-side comparisons of the fuel consumption, the fossil fuel consumption, the electricity, and looking at what you're using today when you make the change.
Thank you. That was a great question, Kevin, and excellent answers from our panelists. We had a question from Shelley Smith. Going back to the topic of sea level rise, what happens to the reef and the ocean when these houses fall into the water as sea levels rise? It sounds like a terrible mess. Do these buildings need to be removed before the sea levels rise and wipe them out, sending all that building material into the ocean? And what about the people who live there?
You know, so places like Sunset, communities, single family residences on the edge of a beach that is retreating with sea level rise, that is a mess. And in fact, it's literally a mess up there. Last week, you had porches falling, you had sandbags that were protecting homes, washing in the surf. It is a real mess. And Sunset Beach is, this is an iconic beach. It's one of our most beautiful beaches, and it's known around the world. So I don't have an answer for you, and government doesn't have an answer for you. We have not enforced existing laws that prevent this sort of behavior. Enforcement is a huge issue. And the existing laws we do have need to be made more robust for the specifics related to sea level rise and shoreline retreat, shoreline movement. As far as developed areas like Waikiki, those the water table is already only a few feet below the ground. So the footings and foundations for these large buildings are already in water. And I don't think that as sea level rises, we're going to see buildings become less stable because of their foundations. I think we do need to worry, however, about waves and especially storm surge during a hurricane hitting those buildings.
Would Ikaika or Senator Lee like to respond to this question regarding policies that could potentially be put in place?
At the city and county of Honolulu level, we had actually started to have discussions before COVID on shoreline retreat in the residential areas. Taking a look at maps such as those that Dr. Fletcher mentioned and that he shared with us this evening, looking at some of those maps and deciding exactly where those lines would be drawn. The decisions that weren't made as to exactly where the lines would be drawn and how they'd be implemented. Those discussions at the city and county level, we did not get to have. But in my discussions with the Office of Climate Change and Resiliency, those are one of the policy initiatives that the office, as well as the council chair's office that I led, seemed to agree on. That we needed to actually take a hard look at that, make those tough decisions, and then share them with the community once we come out with actual maps that folks can both understand and agree upon. But we didn't have an opportunity to have those discussions, unfortunately. But yet, I feel the discussions need to be had. I see Ernest Nishizaki's point here that we also need to rely on the private sector to offer their financial kokua and contributions because government can't do it alone. And Ernest is right. In Waikiki, we've had some substantial financial contributions in the form of money commitments from some of our resort owners who did step forward to offer cash as well as planning to help with sea level rise mitigation suggestions. And I think that we're going to have to do more of that across the state. But in Waikiki, we did have some of our owners step forward and offer their kokua, not just with mana'o thoughts, but actually with kala in terms of money.
I'll just chime in and add, I think, that Waikiki example's a perfect example of folks stepping up to the plate. And in the broader spectrum, when we were moving our, broad state goals to deal with climate change, I think we had a lot of support, not only from Republicans and Democrats, across the political spectrum, but we had support from labor and environmental groups and the Chamber of Commerce and others along the way, because we know, and everybody kind of knows that there's going to be impacts, and it's going to be an economic loss if we don't prepare for it, for the public sector and the private sector. So those folks were willing to step up to the table, knowing that everybody's going to have to play a role and do it together. And that's really encouraging, because we don't see that in a lot of other places around the country.
Great answers. Mahalo, everyone. We have Kanoi Casimiro, who asked us, are there any policies being planned or in place to encourage eco-friendly development?
We did start that discussion at the city and county level. Prior to COVID happening, one of the discussions that was started was actually talking about air conditioning and when air conditioning would be allowed. And if it were to be allowed, the different levels of insulation that residential structures, for example, would need to have for air conditioning to be allowed. The parking restrictions have already come into play. And we could see that around the city and county of Honolulu at some of our newer shopping malls, as well as at some of our existing shopping malls where large scale redevelopment has taken place. We've also done much as policymakers, both at the city and state level, from what I've seen, encouraging entities like Recycle, Reuse Hawaiʻi that have come forward, and from what I've seen, have offered some substantial reuse and recycle efforts that have been offered. Certainly, with offices like that have been started in Honolulu, if we can encourage the other neighbor island counties to follow suit, or better yet, start an initiative at the state level, I think we'll make a lot more progress. Unfortunately, as we started those discussions with the other neighbor island counties, Maui and Kauai County in particular, COVID happened. The Hawaii State Association of Counties annual conferences did not occur, and those discussions weren't able to be had. But we were looking forward to discussing those charter amendments with our neighbor island counties that could have resulted in similar office establishments and similar policies moving forward.
I'll add into that one of the most exciting places for change coming up in that way is really when you think about how people get around, because right now transportation accounts for about 2/3 of our emissions in Hawaii, our fossil fuel emissions, and trying to deal with that is something that we really haven't figured out. We all know that we sit in traffic for hours on end, depending where you live, pretty much no matter where you live, anytime you're trying to go somewhere. And that's just not helping anything. So trying to figure out how to really rethink the way that we get around. The city and county has been sort of a leader on this, way more than the state has, providing mobility options for people to more safely live, work, and play in the same community, to develop differently so that you don't have to live in one place and drive halfway across the island to get around, or your kid doesn't have to get in a car to be driven to school. They'd actually have a safe bike path that they can take themselves. These kinds of quality of life issues aren't just about a better quality of life, but it is truly reducing the amount of vehicle miles that people have to travel every day, reducing our overall carbon footprint. And that's something that really the state actually can learn a lot from, because we're way behind a lot of other places right now.
Ernest commented, based on Dr. Fletcher's sea level rise, perhaps we should consider electric sea vessels to transport residents from various communities to work and visitors from airports to resorts. What are your thoughts on that?
I like that idea. I think the devil's in the details. Funding is always limited. Is this where we devote significant portions of funding, or are there other aspects of adapting to sea level rise? And what do the port facilities look like? Presumably electric sea vehicles to transport residents would be rather small, so we could have sort of small community scale docking facilities, but then we also have strong winds. It's often white capping out there in the ocean, and it's a pretty rigorous environment. So the devil's in the details there, but I certainly think that should be on the table.
Great. As we're approaching our hour, I wanted to ask one more question that we had listed. We mentioned earlier that we live in an island state, and are there any lessons we can learn from past traditions and ways that Native Hawaiians used to live? And perhaps maybe any methods that can help us move forward in the future?
Native Hawaiians thrived in Hawaii for centuries on the ancient ahupua'a system. One of the core beliefs and practices of that system was never taking more from the aina, from the land, from your environment than you put into it. Never, ever taking more than was necessary. The concept of land ownership was also a foreign one. Human beings were seen as stewards of land, never owners of it. And the mindset was always that you were to leave the place better than you found it, so that it wasn't only going to be there for your children, but also for future generations, 100 years and further into the future. That was always that mindset. I think what we can learn from that is, as some have mentioned earlier tonight, with food sustainability, looking at how we can possibly encourage farming where folks can be able to make a go of it. We do have government lands that are zoned agriculture that could have some subsidies provided. As a former county elected official, most of the services that county government provided were deemed essential core services, meaning that these services were relied upon by our citizens to be able to function and to be able to live. One of the ideas that we're talking about, as I've gone across the state and talked with people in farming, cattle farming, people who are in actual plant production farming, treating agriculture as a core service, where government would provide subsidies to people who are actually farming, who submit a farming plan, agricultural plan, and can actually see it into production. Those are some of the discussions that we're having in order to be able to promote food sustainability and being able to also ensure that we are not taking more from the environment that we need or that we can put into it. And in the discussions that I'm having with those people who are in farming and in ag production, I believe that government could get to that point where we're starting to treat farming and agriculture as a core service. Because as one farmer on the Big Island mentioned to me, if people can't eat and then people can't live, the gentleman asked me, brother, then why are those other services that you're talking about as core services, roads, infrastructure, sewage, police, ambulance, fire, if you're dead, why do the rest matter? Great point. But I think that, and I would agree with that gentleman who actually raised this point with me, that those subsidies are certainly possible if government is simply willing to take a look at it. And we need to be.
Thank you for that. Senator, do you want to share your thoughts?
Oh, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think Ikaika's right on the money. The Native Hawaiian community that lived here long before we were here were completely sustainable and did things in a way that was respectful of the environment they lived in. I think today, putting it in context, we know that if we move back toward that kind of local reliance, local sustainability, it's going to be a huge cost savings for us, for energy, for fuel, for food, for all the things that we are paying through the teeth for. And so dealing with climate really isn't just about being environmentally friendly, although it is. It's about reducing our cost of living over the long term and for our next generation. And most of all about preserving our way of life. And I think that's really what I think he was talking about and what I think Chip and all the rest of us have been hoping for. And I think it's great that folks are really focused on it now.
Any closing thoughts from Dr. Fletcher?
Well, I just want to thank the audience members once again, and I want to thank my fellow panelists. It's been wonderful to push out the hard news of climate change. I hope you all realize that if we do not act in food, water, healing our society, we are going to face a much more difficult future, but that does not need to be the case. I think from the cultural background that we have in Hawaii, the lessons of food production and land management from a regenerative rather than extractive point of view, all the way up to the ridge tops where we need to continue removing invasive species because the ecosystem up there is evolved to capture water from the clouds and to naturally recharge our aquifers. I think Hawaii has a lot of attributes and there's a lot of reason for us to be hopeful. At the same time, we have a lot of work to do to get there.
And thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher, for sharing your expertise with us. You have been an expert in the fields of climate change and also sharing with people the real consequences of climate change, but also in doing your best to bring forward the policies that government could discuss to try to make a difference. But you've also been able to explain this to average everyday people like me in a context that we can understand by presenting maps, real pictures that actually show what this will look like. And again, I must stress in ways that we can all understand. Senator Lee has been a leading advocate for policy that is environmentally friendly. He has attended numerous conferences on not only climate change, but also the environment. He's been a leading environmentalist. and environmental policy advocate during his time in the legislature. Back in the time before it was popular to have that mindset, he's been talking about these types of policies for a long time before he even became a legislator. So the fact that we've had you both with us this evening to share your expertise and ways that we can all move forward, not only as government, but really as a community, because we all live here, has been very, very educational and has helped all of us to be able to understand more about climate change, as well as the policies that we could hope to see to make life better for all of us who call this place home.
I want to wish a warm mahalo to our panelists tonight. You guys had such a great, productive conversation, and it was due in part to our awesome attendees who came out with their excellent questions. And I think tonight we really fostered a productive conversation about sustainability. And I know we only scratched the surface. I know there's way more out there to discuss. But just a friendly reminder, Dr. Fletcher sent the link to the sea level rise map earlier, so feel free to check it out. Just Google SLR viewer, or you can copy and paste the link that is in the chat. And also another friendly reminder is that our I MUA HAWAIʻI series will continue next week. So please be sure to check your emails for the latest updates and register and join us again. We look forward to seeing you. Mahalo, everyone.
Aloha, everyone. Mahalo.
Mahalo.
Aloha.